Jimmy said, Rodney, that's not true. And then Rodney called you, and you said, no, Rodney, that's not true. But the Lord's told me what to do with Rodney, and I dusted my feet off, okay? Doesn't mean God bless him, go do his thing, but now I know what I'm dealing with. And Marcus had to deal with Rodney before too.
But just to clarify,
there are things y'all don't know.
But just to clarify,
Rodney has done and said that your dad was furious about.
I'm sure.
So,
but just to clarify, like I know he loves you. Rodney gave her
Jonathan, we don't need to
a very generous gift.
It doesn't matter.
After my dad passed, $100,000. So he loves her.
Yeah.
So he did this out of love.
What does it look like when a woman who has spent her entire adult life broadcasting the gospel to billions of people stops being able to receive truth herself? What happens when the red flags land on her doorstep, not from strangers, not from critics, not from people with no personal investment, but from her own children, from trusted ministry peers, from a fellow widow writing from inside the same grief? What happens when she hears all of it, processes all of it, and responds by giving everyone in the room 60 seconds and walking out the door? That is the story we are telling today. Because in the months leading up to the marriage that fractured the Lamb family and set Daystar television network on the trajectory it is still navigating in 2026, Joni Lamb did not go in blind. She went in warned, repeatedly, specifically, urgently, and from every direction that mattered. Before we go any further, here is what you need to know. Everything in this video is drawn from verified primary sources. The core documented reporting comes from the Roys Report, founded by Julie Roys, a veteran investigative journalist and former CBS television reporter. Additional sources include the authenticated audio recording of the July 11th, 2023 meeting between Joni Lamb, Jimmy Evans, Jonathan Lamb, and Suzy Lamb, published in full by the Roys Report, along with published emails verified and linked by the Roys Report, the published letter from Denise Boggs of Living Waters Ministry, the published letter from Pastor Valerie Hartwell, court-filed divorce records, and Religion News Service and Charisma News coverage. Where accounts are personal testimony, we will say so. Where documents are verified and published, we will say that too. To understand the weight of what was being warned against, you first have to understand the timeline, because the sequence of dates on its own tells you nearly everything you need to know about why the people closest to Joni Lamb were alarmed. Marcus Lamb, Joni's husband of nearly 40 years and the co-founder of Daystar Television Network, died on November 30th, 2021, from complications of COVID-19. He was 64 years old. The grief was public and immediate. Joni appeared on air with visible difficulty. Her children were devastated. The broader evangelical world mourned a man who had, alongside Joni, built something genuinely extraordinary, from a salvaged transmitter and a single local station in Montgomery, Alabama, into one of the most watched Christian broadcast networks on earth, available in more than 2 billion homes globally. Every reasonable expectation in that moment was that Joni would take the time that grief demands before making any major life decisions. Then, on January 27th, 2022, a divorce filing was made in a Colorado court, 58 days after Marcus Lamb drew his last breath. The filing was made by Doug Weiss. His wife's name was Lisa Weiss. They had been married for more than 30 years. Doug Weiss was, at the time of this filing, a licensed Christian psychologist and the founder of Heart to Heart Counseling Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He was the author of more than 40 books on topics including sexual addiction, marriage, and Christian intimacy. He had been a repeat guest on Daystar's programming for years and was known throughout the Lamb family. The divorce filing date, January 27th, 2022, exactly 58 days after Marcus Lamb's death, is a documented court record confirmed and linked by the Roys Report. By May 31st, 2022, less than 6 months after Marcus died, Doug Weiss was a divorced man. And by the time those divorce papers were filed, the relationship between Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb was already developing in ways that her family was beginning to notice and to fear. It is important to be precise about what the documented record shows at this point, because this story is not about abstract theology. It is about specific, concrete concerns raised by specific people who were watching specific events unfold in real time. Doug Weiss had built his entire career and his entire public platform around helping couples save their marriages. That was his brand. Those were his books. That was the professional expertise that had earned him every guest appearance on Daystar. He was the man other Christian couples turned to when their marriage was in crisis. And here was that same man, ending a 30-year marriage of his own with unusual speed, 58 days after the death of a prominent widow's husband. Joni's children, her ministry colleagues, and her broader community did not need a theology degree to see what that looked like. They needed only eyes. The first person to put those concerns into writing with both authority and intimacy was Denise Boggs. Denise Boggs was not a stranger to this situation. She was a longtime friend and ministry ally of the entire Lamb family, and she appeared regularly on Daystar's programming through her organization, Living Waters Ministry. But what gave her letter its particular weight was not her platform. It was the fact that she had personally counseled both Doug and Lisa Weiss in the period immediately before their divorce. She had heard from both sides. She knew the inside of that marriage and that separation in ways almost no one else in Joni's world did, and she was deeply alarmed by what she was watching unfold. She wrote an impassioned letter to Joni's family that was published in full by the Roys Report. In it, Boggs wrote that she had voiced her concerns about Weiss directly to Joni, but that Joni had refused to hear her. She wrote that Joni had come under a spirit of deception due to Weiss's influence. And then she wrote the words that cut through everything. He is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He is of no caliber for such a high platform. She added that Joni did not endorse divorce until she came under his deception, and that by using the Daystar platform, the enemy had successfully mocked the marriage covenant using one of the strongest Christian television networks in the nation. Those are devastating words from a woman who had personally counseled the very marriage Doug Weiss was walking away from. She was not speculating. She was not operating on rumor. She was someone who had sat with both parties, heard their accounts, and formed a judgment based on direct knowledge, and her judgment was unambiguous. When Jonathan Lamb received that letter, he gathered the family to confront Joni directly. His account of what happened next, given to the Roys Report, is precise and specific. He said Joni allowed each person no more than 60 seconds to share their heart. She listened to each of her children for 60 seconds. And then, in Jonathan's words, she said all she sees from them is fear and rushed out the door to fly to New York with Doug. That phrase, all she sees from us is fear, is the dismissal that ended the conversation. Whether Joni said the word fear once or many times, the documented outcome is identical. A family that had gathered to pour out genuine concern was given 60 seconds per person, labeled as fearful, and left standing in the room as their mother boarded a plane. Think about what that moment meant for Jonathan and Suzy specifically. They were not peripheral critics raising objections from a distance. They were people who had built their professional lives inside Daystar. Jonathan was Joni's son, Marcus's chosen successor, the man who had worked alongside his parents for years in that ministry. They had just lost their father and father-in-law. They were watching their mother accelerate into a new relationship with a man who had filed for divorce from his own wife of 30 years, 58 days after Marcus died. And the answer they received was 60 seconds and a door. But the warnings were not only coming from within the family, because 4 months before the wedding, a man arrived at Daystar who was not easy to dismiss. His name was Rodney Howard-Browne. Rodney Howard-Browne is not a fringe figure in the charismatic Christian world. Born in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, on June 12, 1961, he came to the United States in the late 1980s, and by the early 1990s had become one of the most recognized revivalist preachers in American evangelical and Pentecostal ministry. He and his wife, Adonica, co-founded Revival Ministries International and The River at Tampa Bay Church. He was a peer, a fellow minister, someone whose voice and relationship with the Lamb family carried genuine weight inside the world they all occupied together. And when Rodney Howard-Browne arrived at Daystar in February of 2023, he did not come to celebrate the engagement. According to Jonathan Lamb's documented testimony to the Roys Report, Howard-Browne came with a direct and unambiguous message. He told Joni to her face, in her own building, with her family present, that her relationship with Doug Weiss was biblically wrong. He told her that if she moved forward and married Doug, she would be living in sin. And he told her with equal clarity that if she went ahead with this marriage, he would not return to Daystar. He would not appear on the network again as long as Doug Weiss was her husband. Jonathan described Howard-Browne as one of the ones who put the fear of God into the room. He said Howard-Browne told them plainly, "This is wrong. Your mother would be living in sin if she moves forward with this relationship, and I won't come back as long as he's married." This account is reported as Jonathan Lamb's direct testimony as published by the Roys Report. It is important to note that Howard-Browne has not publicly confirmed or denied this account. We present it as documented testimony, exactly as the Roys Report presents it. A respected revivalist minister, someone Joni knew, someone the Daystar audience knew, someone with decades of credibility in the charismatic Christian world, came to her building, sat across from her, and told her directly what he believed the biblical consequences of her decision would be. He attached a personal cost to his warning. He made it real and specific. He told her what it would cost him to walk away if she didn't listen. And 4 months later, on June 10th, 2023, Joni walked down the aisle anyway. Then there was the voice that arrived from perhaps the most morally significant place of all, a place that was personal in a way that no theological argument could be. That voice belonged to Pastor Valerie Hartwell. What made her letter unique was not her platform or her credentials. It was her circumstances. Pastor Hartwell was also a widow. Her husband, Senior Pastor Roy Hartwell, had passed away in March of 2023. She knew from direct lived experience what it meant to lose a husband of many years and to navigate the grief that follows. She was not speaking about Joni's situation from the outside. She was speaking from exactly the same terrain. Pastor Hartwell wrote to Joni widow to widow. Her letter, shared publicly and documented in the source material for this video, named the timeline directly and without softening. She called out Doug Weiss not primarily for his theology, but for what his behavior revealed practically, a man who had not given Joni and her children the time that grief requires before entering a new relationship. In her own words, she wrote that she had called Weiss out for not giving Joni and her children adequate time to grieve and transition from the loss of their father and grandfather before jumping into a new relationship. But Hartwell's letter went further. She raised the professional dimension that others had noticed, but perhaps not articulated as pointedly. Doug Weiss was a marriage counselor, a psychologist who had built his entire career and public identity around helping people save their marriages. Those were his published books. That was the expertise behind every Daystar appearance. And yet, here was that same man, with all that professional training and knowledge of grief psychology and emotional vulnerability, ending a 30-year marriage of his own within months of meeting a recently widowed woman. Valerie Hartwell named the irony in the plainest possible terms. As a psychologist, Doug should have known better than to encroach on a grieving family and widow so early. This is shame on him, she wrote, but double shame on you as a mother, grandmother, and president of Daystar for allowing this unsavory, ungodly marriage to occur that has fractured your family and Daystar. Those are hard words. They are not polite words, but they are the words of someone who believed she was watching a preventable catastrophe unfold and was willing to say so clearly, even at the cost of the relationship. There was also something sitting in plain sight that required no theological expertise to notice. In 2019, Doug Weiss appeared on Daystar alongside Marcus and Joni Lamb and described his wife Lisa on camera in words that were warm and public and unambiguous. He said she had the purest heart he had ever met and that she loved and served with excellence. Those words were preserved on video and published by The Roy's Report, which obtained the clip after Daystar filed 3 separate copyright strikes against a journalist who had posted it publicly. 3 strikes on a 4-year-old clip of a man praising his own wife. Then, in March of 2023, when Jimmy Evans appeared on Joni's Table Talk program to announce the engagement, the framing around Lisa Weiss had shifted dramatically. Evans implied that the marriage had involved abuse severe enough to constitute biblical grounds for divorce, that Weiss had not simply left, but had been abandoned and mistreated. In the span of 4 years, the narrative about the same woman had traveled from the purest heart I have ever met to a story of abandonment and abuse. That shift was noticed. It was documented. And it was one more piece of the picture that the people warning Joni were asking her to see. Then came July 11th, 2023, and the meeting that changed everything in a room with a recording running that nobody on Joni's side knew existed. The meeting was arranged by Joni and Jimmy Evans. Jonathan and Suzy were told they were coming together to talk. What they walked into was 90 minutes of pressure, documented in precise and verbatim detail on an audio recording that Jonathan gave to the Roy's Report and which has been published in full and authenticated. The recording has accumulated more than 23,000 comments on YouTube, nearly all of them critical. What it captured is not paraphrased or summarized in what follows. These are the words spoken in that room. Evans told Jonathan directly on tape. Submission means she is the voice of God to you. Jonathan asked for clarification. He said, she's the voice of God to me? Evans confirmed it. She's the voice of God to you. Jonathan pressed further, asking whether that meant he couldn't hear from God himself. Evans replied, outside of Daystar. What she says is God in Daystar. This is the voice of God in Daystar. When Jonathan asked who Joni herself was accountable to, Evans said, that's not your concern. Your concern is to do what she says. And if you can't be here. On the same recording, Evans called Jonathan's theological convictions a spirit of witchcraft and labeled his stubbornness an idol, invoking the scriptural passage where Saul's rebellion was compared to the sin of witchcraft. And Joni herself, on the same tape, said these exact words to her own son and daughter-in-law. You've opened up yourself, both of you, to demonic activity in your family and with your kids by your rebellion against me. She added, God wouldn't be pleased with this. You'll bring a curse upon you and your kids. A mother invoking demonic activity and a spiritual curse against her own children because they declined to read a viewer comment on air praising her new marriage. That is not a theological discussion. That is what was captured on an authenticated recording in a room at Daystar television network. The firing came minutes later. Suzy told Joni she could not go against her convictions by reading the comment on air. Joni's response, preserved word for word on the tape, was, "Don't come back then. You're gone. You're fired. If you can't read a nice comment about Doug, I don't want you here." After Suzy was dismissed, Joni turned her attention to Jonathan and told him, in Evans's presence, this is going to be his Alamo, so he's going to handle it and handle her, or not. But I can tell him, this will probably decide your leadership role here at Daystar, how he handles that. The meeting ended. Jonathan wrote an email to his mother documenting what he had experienced. In it, he wrote that he felt trapped in an impossible position, that things were completely out of hand, and that he never thought in his life he would be put in this position. Joni replied that for now, payroll was not being affected, and that she would let Jonathan know when she was ready to meet on the issue. Beyond the July meeting, there was the documented role of Jimmy Evans in publicly framing and defending the marriage from the beginning. Evans was the founder of XO Marriage, a ministry he had built over 3 decades. He appeared on Joni's Table Talk program in March 2023 to announce the engagement and provided the theological framing Joni used to justify the decision. He was, by his own admission on the July recording, one of the chief voices she had brought in to reinforce her authority over her son. And in early 2025, after months of public backlash that followed the release of the July audio, Evans announced his departure from XO Marriage, the ministry he had founded, citing a desire to focus on end times ministry. Religion News Service and the Christian Post both reported his departure and confirmed the backlash context. He had spent 30 years building a marriage ministry. He left it after publicly claiming that a mother was the voice of God to her own children for refusing to endorse her remarriage on air. On June 10, 2023, Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss were married. Not one of her 3 children attended the wedding. Jonathan was not there. Rachel was not there. Rebecca was not there. 3 children who had grown up inside Daystar, who had built their professional lives around that ministry, who had given their adult years to the institution their parents created together. Not one of them stood at that altar. Whatever has been said in the time since about responsibility for the family fracture, the fact of that absence is a statement that requires no interpretation. What followed is documented in detail in previous reporting and in the public record. Suzy was fired on July 11th. Jonathan was placed on a performance improvement plan, demoted, and had his salary cut from $250,000 to $150,000 annually. His in-laws were removed from the network one by one. A GPS tracker was found in his company vehicle. A private investigator followed the family on residential streets with their children. On November 16, 2024, exactly 1 year to the day after Jonathan had refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement, Daystar's head of security arrived at his home on a Saturday morning, carrying a firearm and wearing a bulletproof vest to deliver a termination letter. More than 30 major programming partners, including Joyce Meyer, Greg Laurie, and Jack Hibbs, departed Daystar throughout 2024 and 2025. And on May 7, 2026, Joni Lamb died in a clinic in Mexico at 65 years old. Jonathan was not at her side. He learned of her death 10 minutes before Daystar announced it publicly on social media. He was told by a corporate attorney what Pastor Valerie Hartwell wrote in her letter before any of this had fully played out reads now less like a warning and more like a description. She wrote that this marriage had fractured the family and fractured Daystar, and that the consequences would be public, painful, and lasting. Denise Boggs wrote that the enemy had successfully used the Daystar platform to mock the marriage covenant using one of the strongest Christian television networks in the nation. Rodney Howard-Browne reportedly told Joni directly in her own building that this was wrong and he would not return. She heard all of it, every voice, every letter, every face-to-face conversation. She heard the family she had raised. She heard the counselor who knew the marriage from the inside. She heard the widow who wrote from within the same grief. She heard the revivalist who made his warning personal and specific and costly, and she gave each of them 60 seconds, called it fear, and boarded the plane. There is a principle embedded in this story that matters to every person watching, regardless of what you think of any individual involved. The dynamic at its center, a person of genuine faith and genuine accomplishment who has decided and for whom any voice that challenges the decision gets pre-labeled as fear or faithlessness or interference, is not unique to Joni Lamb. It is a human pattern. All of us carry the capacity to categorize the most honest voices in our lives as negative or unsupportive, and to grant more access to the voices that make us feel confirmed. The question this story puts to every person who watches it is not ultimately about Joni Lamb. It is about who in your own life has the actual freedom to tell you the truth. And when they do, or what do you call it? Joni Lamb called it fear, and the story that was built from that answer is the story of what gets constructed when warnings go unheard and the people who love you most are no longer in the room. If this video has given you something to think about, share it with someone who is following the Daystar story. The full primary source reporting by Julie Roys and the Roys Report, including the authenticated audio recording of the July 2023 meeting, the published letters from Denise Boggs and Pastor Valerie Hartwell, and the full body of investigative journalism behind this video is available at roysreport.com. All links are in the description below. We will continue following this story. Thank you for watching. God bless you.